Do you lead like a person or do you lead like a position? If you are confused by that question, I have a great conversation that is worth listening to. I sit down with Mark Carpenter, who is the author of a book by the same name. And if you want to make sure that your leadership legacy is one you can be proud of, stay tuned. Hi, I'm Karin Reed. I'm a four-time author, Emmy Award-winning broadcast journalist, and communication expert on helping people to own the room, whether it be a physical one or a virtual one. Welcome to Speaker Dynamics. Mark Carpenter, it is such a delight to have you here. And I will tell you, I read this in like one sitting, and I also applied multiple highlighting marks to the whole thing because there was so much good stuff in the book. Lead like a person, not a position. And I just want to kick things off by asking you what inspired you to write it in the first place.
Well, thank you, Karin, and it just does my heart good to see the marking up of the book, because that's really the intent that I wrote it for, was for people to have to use it, to make it useful for them. I also, before I answer your question, I just wanted to get to that other point that you made, that you read it in one sitting. It is a book that can be digested fairly quickly, fairly easily. My main motive behind this was, as I've done work around storytelling, and we've talked about my book, Master Storytelling, before, I had somebody ask me, so what's your big idea? What's the big point? And what I came to was people connecting with people. And I thought, okay, well, why is that important? And I look back on my career, and the times that I had the most regrets about were the times when I treated people less well than they deserved. I didn't treat people like the people they deserve to be treated like. And I would love the opportunity to help other people not have the same regrets that I had. And leading like a person would have helped me in those moments to overcome some of those challenges and to not have some of those same regrets. I think we're in an age and a time in business where the connectivity of people, we have this connected world, but the connectivity of people is even more and more important, especially in the business realm. And if we aren't leading like people, I think it's going to create problems within the workplace, problems within the teams, and problems within individual lives.
Can we talk a little bit though about what the title means? Because you're talking about leading like a person versus leading like a position. How do you define those two different approaches?
Yeah, and probably the best way to define it is to share the story that I shared at the beginning of the book. And I see from the smile you remember which story that is. Because I had that question asked of me as I was developing this concept. I was making the point, we need to have people lead like people. And somebody looked at me kind of funny and said, well, but leaders are people. So if they're not leading like people, what are they leading like? And my gut response was thinking about kind of the worst times that I'd ever been led, or the worst behaviors of some of my leaders. And my first thought was, well, they're kind of monsters in those situations. But it's like, they're not. And then I took a step back from that, because I don't think any leader gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to go to work and be an ogre today. I'm going to go and just be a tyrant. Nobody really thinks that way. So how do we slip out of our humanity, and what do we slip into? And I was just reminded of an experience that I had when I was managing marketing communications for a really small company. And I had written a press release about a new product. The CEO was kind of the last check off on it. And he had me add a paragraph about a feature I hadn't even heard from anybody else about. And then I found out that that feature was actually not in that version of the product. And so I thought, misunderstanding. So we went back to him and I said, hey, I just learned from the CTO that feature is actually not in this version of the product. I need to take that paragraph out. And he said, oh, leave it in, just make it defensible. And I kind of had the same look you just did. I looked at him and said, I don't know what that means. What do you mean, make it defensible? He said, well, just write it in a way so that if somebody questions us about it, we can tell them what we meant was it's going to be in the next version.
Oh my.
And I said, I'm really uncomfortable with that. I just think that's going to cause us a lot of problems. And when talking to the CTO, he's not even sure that they can develop it for the next version. So that could even be inaccurate. And so at this point, the conversation's been between two people. Right at that time, though, it fundamentally shifted. He stood up from his desk. He pointed his finger at me. he says, look, you work for me. I sign your paycheck. That means you do what I tell you to do. Now get out of here.
Boy.
Okay. At that moment, he changed from leading like a person to leading like a position, because the conversation was no longer between two people. It was between two positions, one with more authority than the other. And he was leaning on that authority to try to get his way.
Mm-hmm.
And that not only damages relationships, it damages business results. Now, I was just stunned. I was like I'd been hit in the face with something. And I stood there for a couple of seconds and realized he was not going to have this conversation with me anymore. And I left. I got the support of the CTO and I said, we got to talk him out of this. And he came back. We did talk him out of it. But once I got that problem fixed, what do you think my next step was?
Well, polishing your resume.
Yeah, it's exactly what it did. Because I was like, I can't live in this kind of environment. And that's one of the highest costs of leading like a position, is you're going to end up with high turnover. You're going to end up, and this company had problems with this, where people would hide problems because they didn't want to have to face that. Now, I also want to be really clear about something. This person was not an ogre. He was a nice guy. There were times that I had great conversations with him. He was great in front of the press when we did press tours. He was articulate. He was a good person. He had a family who loved him. But in tough moments, he tended to slip into, I'm the CEO, just do what I say. And that became the leadership style that he was known for.
Interesting.
And
So I was going to ask you, do people fall into one category or the other at all times? But it sounds like they can shift depending upon the circumstances.
oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And really, it's a moment by moment, hour by hour type of situation. And there are times when you may need to lean on your position authority. There are times when you as a leader, you're the one who has to make the decision.
Right.
But if you lead like a person enough in those moments, people can be forgiving of that and say, okay, I get it. You had to make a snap decision in that you took a consult from the team. You made the decision. You're the leader. We moved on. But if you lean on that more and more and more, it creates those problems with the team and within the organization.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, are there certain industries where that command and control, lead like a position attitude is more apt to happen?
It's interesting because I think there may be, because I think that command and control style really came from an industrial age mentality. It came from a production mentality. And so in production style companies, maybe that could be more prominent. But it's been interesting as I've been out speaking about lead like a person and doing some workshops on it. Some of the clients that have come to me are people in those heavy manufacturing environments. They are seeing the need for more of that connection from their leaders, particularly from their frontline leaders. And they realize that this is a shift that we've got to make. It's not optional anymore. We've got to be able to make this shift to be able to have the teams working better together.
Do you think it's like a societal change that happened over time? Or, because I think there probably was a time where that was okay, more okay than it is today. Like, what do
Yeah.
you think are the environmental factors around it that cause people to say, hey, this isn't working or this is putting me at risk?
I think really it's the shift from the industrial-based economy to a knowledge-based economy, that we rely more and more on the people, and not people as a human resource. We talk about people as a human resource. Well, that makes them like they're a widget or a computer or a pen or something like that. They're a tool to be worked with. But in the knowledge-based economy, it's more important to have the ideas and the people's thought processes and to be really engaged in their work. The other side of that in our technology age is people have options. Back in the early part of the industrial age, where command and control was very prominent, people were like, I got to have this job. I got to stay here. And this is my pension. This is what I'm going to do for the next 40 years. I got to keep my head down and do my work from 8 to 5. And then I go home and I never think about it again. Well, these days we have different expectations. We have a lot more expectations of when you connect at work and what you do. And people have a lot more options. People have options to say, you know what, boss, you just treated me badly. I'm going to go out and drive Uber for a couple months until I figure out what I want to do.
Yeah.
And I don't have to be here.
People
And
vote with their
they can
feet.
find other options to make ends meet, where they don't have that kind of tie that companies used to bind people with.
So interesting. It makes so much sense when you lay it out like that, for sure. People will say, hey, enough is enough, and there are other places I can go. And just like you did, whenever you felt uncomfortable with the response that you got from your CEO, you said, okay, I'm going to do something different here because I don't like the way I'm being treated, or perhaps the values that are being reflected here. But I wanted to speak to the leaders who listen to this podcast. This is all about leadership communication. And you talk about the big three behaviors that are commonly displayed by people who lead like a person. I will list them one by one, but then let's go into each of them. So you say, listen intently, communicate intentionally, and recognize individually. That's so brilliant. So tell me about the importance of listening when it comes to leading like a person.
Yeah, and the reason these become the big three for me is because they overlap other leadership behaviors that people need. And
Hmm.
so if we can emphasize, if we can just get people thinking about these, they will tie into many other leadership behaviors that they need. And particularly for first-time leaders, listening intently is so important because this is how you learn what the problem is. If you're not listening intently, you are likely as a leader to come up with a brilliant solution to the wrong problem.
Absolutely. Hear, hear, Mark.
Yeah, I figured I could get an amen from you on that,
Oh
Karin.
yeah, absolutely.
But that's the essence. And it's funny because I think we unintentionally, when we move into a leader position, go, I'm the leader now. And I remember when I was a first time leader, and it was like, I'm the one that's supposed to have all the answers.
Yes.
And I put that pressure on myself to have all the answers, when in the reality, if I talked to my team members, they had better answers than I had. But if I'm not listening for those, I'm not going to get those. And that makes me a less effective leader.
Yeah, I think about active listening, and I teach this as well. And one of the things that I find is very common is if somebody asks a leader a question, they'll start formulating the answer about halfway through the question and don't listen to the entire thing. And as a result, their response is missing the mark. So, this resonates very deeply with me, the importance of listening intently, but it also requires humility, right? To
Oh,
do that.
absolutely. And it's interesting because if you say to somebody, lead with humility, they don't really know what that means. But if you say, listen better, if you listen intently, and as you teach the skills and I teach the skills for listening more intently, that actually demonstrates the humility that they need to have, that they want to have as a leader.
Yeah.
Because the other part of that is you were talking about people come to you with a question when you're a leader. I remember as a first time leader, I felt like I have to have the answer to this. And I don't think that's true. I think one of the great traits of listening as a leader is to say, all right, well, what do you think we should do about that? You've come to me with this question. You've clearly thought about it. What are your thoughts around this? And let's collaborate on this. And then you're going to develop leaders from your people rather than them just relying on you to solve all their problems.
Yeah. I love when I'm conducting training and somebody asks me a question I don't know the answer to. Because I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a new thing. Let me go figure this out. And I'm going to get back to you. I mean, I actually find that very joyful when that occurs because,
Yeah.
I am certainly not the font of all answers to all communication conundrums. And I like having those knowledge gaps exposed for myself.
Well, and let's take that another step further. I very often, when I get a question I don't know the answer to, I'll say, that is a great question. Does there anybody else have any thoughts around that? And I let other people share their thoughts on it, and I learn from them. And then I may still go do some research on it. But a lot of times the research has been done by other people in the room, and they can draw the answer out.
That's so true. That whole dynamic of a group training where you can, have the wisdom of crowds is so very valuable. But
Yep.
let's talk about communicate intentionally. You know that, I'm going to love this. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, and communicating intentionally is more than just passing on information. One of the one of the exercises I do at the beginning of my Lead Like a Person workshop is I say, think of your very best leaders you've had and the most challenging leaders you've had, and what are the character traits that you see from those people. And no names get mentioned. We take that off the table, but very commonly, the best leaders, they say, they communicated with me well,
Hmm.
and the difficult leaders withheld information. And so but it's not just communicating intentionally is not just about not withholding information. It's helping people understand not just what to do, but why. What are we really trying to accomplish here? And this ties into the work that I do around master storytelling, about where if you want people to understand what actions to take, tell them the story of the benefit to them. Tell them the story of the outcome. Show them the why behind it so that they can see what they need to do and be more motivated to do it. And so it's being really intentional about your communication and being clear about what you need people to do. You can't hold people accountable for behaviors that you haven't made clear to them.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so
Yeah.
communicating intentionally is being really clear about what those expectations are. And then it's also the follow up of that to hold people accountable by communicating intentionally in terms of what you saw that happened that you didn't expect versus what you did expect.
Yeah.
And
The
so
information
it's just,
hoarding is a major problem.
yeah. And it becomes one of those, there's that old adage of information is power, or knowledge is power. And that's an old philosophy too, of holding that close to the vest.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so, as much as you can, communicate openly with people and get them to the why.
and give them some credit because you don't have to be all sunshine and roses when you're communicating. Oftentimes you need to tell tough stories, but if you explain the why behind what needs to happen or what has occurred, uh, people will understand, or if you're doing a good job they will understand, and they will be more accepting than if they just see the action occur without any sort of context.
Yeah. If I can give a quick example of where that
Yeah,
shows up
love
in
it.
a very public way, I travel a lot. You probably travel a lot too. So, any of our listeners who have been traveling, you've probably experienced this. You get on the airplane, everybody's seated. Maybe they've even done the safety briefing, and you're still sitting there at the gate.
Love
And you
hanging
sit
out
there, and
on
you
the
sit
plane.
there, and you sit there. And it's like, why are we not moving? That gets people irritated. I have been on airlines also where we sit there for a couple of minutes and then they come on and they say, hey, here's what we're experiencing. This is why we're waiting. Thank you for your patience. I am much more patient, and the other passengers are much more patient when we know what's going on. When there's an acknowledgement of, we know you're waiting, and here's why. Here's what's happening behind the scenes. And for the most part, there's no reason they can't share that information with us. So I
Yeah.
don't know why they don't do that more regularly, but that happens in leadership too. We just say, well, okay, I don't really have information to give them, so I'm just not going to say anything. Tell them why you're not sharing information with them. If you don't have anything to share, just be more transparent about what's going on.
I hope we have airline pilots who are listening to this, Mark, because I am with you on that. So if they say, here's the deal, we're waiting for, the, luggage from the other plane, like I'm fine with it. Okay, I can deal. But it's sitting there with the unknown that just drives me absolutely batty.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about the third one, which I think is really important and an interesting point that you brought up, which is recognize individually.
Yeah. I,
Explain.
Yeah, and so it's a counter to what we're often given as first time leaders. We're often given as first time leaders, okay, here's how to hold people accountable when they don't do the right thing. And so if that's all I know, how to hold people accountable for doing the wrong thing, what do
Hmm.
I start looking for?
Yeah, the mistakes.
The mistakes. I
Hmm.
start looking for when people are doing the wrong things, because now I know how to deal with that. What we don't teach people is, what do you do when they do the right thing? And so typically leaders do nothing when people do the right thing. And so they spend all their time telling people what they're doing wrong, but not acknowledging what they do right. And I'm not suggesting with this, you need to throw a party for everybody every time they do their job. But if you can just give a simple point of recognition to people to say, hey, Karin, I noticed how you followed through with that client, and that made such a big difference for them. I appreciate you taking just that little extra effort on that, because that makes a difference for our company, for our team, and particularly for that individual client. Thank you for doing that.
And specificity is key too. You don't want to be like, hey, you're doing a great job, because it's too mushy, right?
Yeah. There's the example that I have in the book there about the person who got a text every morning from her manager that says, hey, thanks for being on the team. Really appreciate you. And the manager sent that exact same message to everybody on the team every day. That has no meaning. That's not recognizing individually. That's checking a box that somebody said, oh, I should recognize my team members. But I have this little formula in there about being very specific about recognizing people. And it doesn't take long. That's one of the pushbacks I get is, well, I don't have time to do this all the time. It's like, no, this is not going to take a long time.
Right.
And the mileage you get off of it is incredible, because you're going to get people's hearts when they know that you care enough to see what they're doing that's right. Years ago, I read a research study, and it was about accountability. And one of the comments and from one of the employees they interviewed just stuck out to me. The person said, I get held accountable for 99% of the things that I do wrong. I get recognized for 1% of the things that I do right.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know about you, that just hurt my heart
Yeah.
when I heard that. And I was like, oh, I hope I never do that to somebody.
Yeah.
And it's amazing the power of just simple acknowledgement. This is the heart of leading like a person, because people want to be seen as people, and recognizing the good that they're doing helps them be seen as people and really builds their commitment to the team.
I wanted to ask you about one of the objections that you proactively brought up in the book, because what you do in each chapter I think is really wise, because you say this is how things should be, and then but what if, and like you throw the objection out there and then answer it. And I wanted to talk about the one where you were saying a common pushback that you hear is, what if our culture rewards position power? You only get ahead here by threatening people, throwing your weight around, and showing who is boss. Is leading like a person going to potentially cap your career path if it runs counter to the culture or the organization that you're in?
Potentially. And my first response to that would be, is that the kind of organization you want to be with?
True.
Is that where you want to be? And who do you want to be as a leader? Is that the kind of leader you want to be? I had a conversation just yesterday with a guy named Justin, and we were talking about this concept of leading like a person. And he talked about getting into a leadership position in an IT organization, and how he would go around and talk to the individuals, and he would see what their needs were. He was doing lead like a person kind of stuff, because he looked at it from the perspective of, what would I have wanted my manager to do?
Yeah.
And the organization didn't do that. In fact, he got called in by his boss and said, I want you to stop doing that because you're making me look bad. Okay.
See ya.
And his response was kind of like, well, it's not that hard to do. You could do it too.
Yeah.
You could come join me here. And he said, but I don't want to fire you because your team's the most productive team in the organization. It's like, so there's the point. Maybe you can make a difference. Maybe you can stand out by leading differently and showing other people the benefits of leading like a person, and that it does produce results, and probably better results than the command and control that other people are working under. Now, you always have options. We talked about that a little bit earlier. And so if you see your organization as, no, they do not appreciate this, they will not appreciate this, maybe it's time to look someplace else. Yeah. Because if you're interested in leading like a person and they're not allowing you to lead like a person, then that's probably not a good fit for you.
Yeah. Great advice, Mark. And to that point, this I knew this half hour would fly, and there are so many other things I want to talk to you about. But I do want to ask you the question that I ask all of my guests, which is, what is your one big takeaway that you would like our listeners to think about, over the next couple of weeks?
And this really came to me in the process of writing the book, and it's there at the end. Who do you want to be as a leader? Can you be more intentional about who you want to be? And as you look at some of the best leaders that you've had and some of those character traits that they've had, how can you set that as a legacy for the people who work for you, the people on your team? And so that is my one big takeaway, is be intentional and conscious about who you want to be as a leader and what legacy you want to leave behind as a leader.
I love that so much. I think it's a great lesson to leave our listeners with. Lead like a person, not like a position, is a quick read, but incredibly valuable. It's chock full. So, Mark Carpenter, thank you for writing the book. Thank you for joining today. And I just appreciate all that you're putting out into the world, all the positivity. So thank you.
Karin, thank you so much for a great conversation, for asking great questions, and for honoring me by having me on your show.
Mark Carpenter is a gem of a person, and I always enjoy my conversations with him, and they always go long, which is why this week's bonus content is an extra piece of conversation that I could not fit into the 30-minute podcast episode. And in it, we talk about those who can benefit most from this book, and perhaps you will recognize yourself in that situation. So if you want to hear more about who can get the most out of the book, Lead Like a Person, Not Like a Position, I would encourage you to go to speakerdynamics.com/bonus content. Once again, that's speakerdynamics.com/bonus content to hear more of my conversation with Mark Carpenter. But for now, I want to thank all of you for listening to this episode. Until next time.